الحمد لله حمدا شاكرين والسلام على سيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you guys in all of your health and your iman and your taqwa. We ask Allah to put goodness for us in this evening. It was the tradition of our Prophet who would teach us to say, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that when the evening would come we would say, اللهم ما أمسى بي من نعمة أو بأحد من خلقك فمنك وحدك لا شريك لك فلك الحمد ولك الشكر. Oh Allah, whatever the evening has brought to me or any of your servants from blessings, then all of them are from you. You have no partners, and all thanks and all praise is due to you. Alhamdulillah, we began this course on this journey really called Unveiling the Crusades some weeks back now, and we looked quite closely at the situation of the medieval European world and what was happening with the Christian church or churches, the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. We spoke about the schism. We spoke about the kind of the genesis behind the movement that became known as the Crusades, and what kind of formulated in the idea of Christian clergy to propose such an expedition as the Crusades, and what that meant for them, in light of Christian tradition, in light of Catholic Church predominance and church power and control, what it meant in light of the schism, what it meant in light of the peace of God and truce movement that was really taking shape in the 10th, 11th centuries. We spoke about the struggle between the papacy and between temporal rulers, and how that also had a bearing on the launching of the crusade. And then we also spoke about the religious significance of the sacred land of Jerusalem, what that meant, for the Christians, the great important place of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, as well as other Christian sites, in Jerusalem, and what was therefore the premier motivation for the launching of the crusade in some crusade letters, but not all of them, where Jerusalem is not mentioned. I think that Jerusalem, in fact, in the letters of Urban II, is, I think, mentioned only in one of the accounts of Pope Urban II's speech. Other ones are about the appeal to help and assist the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus, and of course we discussed a lot of that before. If you want to know more, I think just go back and just look at the early episodes. We looked at that in quite some detail, looking at the appeal of Alexius Comnenus, the rise of the Seljuks from the Battle of Manzikert, 1071. We spoke about also the other events that are happening in Europe at that time, the Battle of Hastings, 1066, and how all of this was taking shape at that time. And then we also spoke about the Muslim world, I think last week or the week before, and the way the Muslim world was really struggling, at least in Bilad al-Sham, in that part of the world, because you had the deaths of so many important rulers like Nizam al-Mulk and Malik Shah, and then the Fatimid Khalif al-Mustansir. You had the death of his Wazir Badr al-Jamali, the Sunni Khalif al-Muqtadi. They were all dying within 2 years. They all died. And therefore the crusade being launched in those years, or just before those years, after those years, was really in the best interest, of course, of the Crusaders, because they could take advantage of that sense of political instability and weakness, in the Muslim world. And it's really, we do wonder, of course, we hypothesize what would it have meant had the Crusaders arrived at a time where these very, very strong and powerful rulers who had been ruling for 30 years, I think Nizam al-Mulk had been ruling for 30 years, and even Malik Shah for 20 years. They were very well established rulers who had disposal of a lot of resources and army, reinforcements, and they could, I think, manage to repel the Crusaders had they arrived at that time. But that all of that, of course, is just guesswork. Everything is in the hands of Allah at the end of the day. So we only look back and we only speculate what might have happened. But at the end of the day, it happened as it happened. And so therefore we kind of left where the People's Crusade The crusade that left from Europe ended up in Constantinople, and then we spoke about the way that Peter the Hermit had this quite a difficult army, meaning in the sense that, but I think we also squared up by saying that they were not all like villagers who went to cause trouble. There were also knights of good repute that were also in that army. And so they ended up in Constantinople. Alexius Comnenus was quite scared about them. That was his reluctance to join the crusade, because he thought that perhaps Peter the Hermit's army could turn against him. And so that was one thing that happened there. But they made it through. I mean, Peter the Hermit, his army was killed off, but he made it through. And he even was there in the siege of Jerusalem in 1099. And that's kind of where we are right now. So we discussed the siege of Antioch last week, and we spoke about the difficulty. It was a very protracted, long siege, and the Muslims in that siege really suffered, as did the Crusader camp. There were some who many deserted, in fact. So by the time they get to Jerusalem, in fact, even at Jerusalem, people are still deserting the Christian camp, and just going back home. But in Antioch, they're also deserting as well, and en route they're deserting as well. And so by the time they get to Jerusalem, the numbers of crusaders are like, they have around 1,200 knights and about 1,300 or 1,200 infantry. So compared to the 60,000 that initially made the vow, to go and fight, for remission of sins and to capture the territory of, or to rescue the Holy Sepulchre Church and go and die for God. We spoke about the vow and the importance of the penance and the importance of the indulgence and what it meant to have a remission of sins. We spoke about the whole context in light of kind of Cluniac monasticism and all of these things. But the point is that by the time they get to Jerusalem, those numbers have really lessened. So they've gone from that big 60,000. Many have died along the way. Many have deserted. And the ones who get there at the end in Jerusalem are 1,200 knights and about 1,300 infantry. So what's going to happen when they get to Jerusalem? Now we should mention that Jerusalem was it was a strong city. In terms of it was a protected city. For the Christians, Jerusalem was not a center of political power. It was not known for its for military or even economy. It was more of a symbolic significance of capturing Jerusalem. All what they're capturing along the way, Antioch and other places, they can have political, economic, military significance. But Jerusalem was this prize, spiritual prize. It was the raison d'etre. It was a reason for the crusade in the first place, and that's what made Jerusalem so significant. For the Muslims, Jerusalem again was never really a center of political bearing. It was not like you had centers of power like Kufa and Basra and Damascus, and these were places of power, but Jerusalem was a spiritually significant city. And so but saying that, the walls of Jerusalem were very strong walls. And so when the Crusaders arrived, the walls of Jerusalem were like 18 meters high and 3 meters wide, and they were double walls. So imagine double walls, 18 meters high and 3 meters wide. Now that's strong, right? So Crusaders, therefore, when they arrived, they had quite a job to do. How would you break through those walls? You would need siege towers, you would need climbing, you would need ladders, scaling ladders, you would need catapults. All of these things should be in your disposal. A lot depends, of course, on how well the people within the city, the defenders, would protect that city. Now, remember, of course, we discussed this, I think, last time or the week before, that before the Crusaders, I think when they were in Antioch, this I think was in 1098, when they're in Antioch, that's when the Seljuks lost power in Jerusalem to the Fatimids, right? The Fatimids, of course, are Shiite Muslims. And so when the Seljuks lose power and they're all leaving now, the Fatimids take power just before the Crusaders arrived. So again, we have to speculate in some cases, as historians, that when the Fatimids took power, they of course knew that the Crusaders were coming. They've taken power. Was the immediate lack of some concern for the fate of Jerusalem partly to do with the fact that the ones who had just taken power from the Muslims are the Fatimids, and of course they are the primary victims of the Crusader onslaught, right? So we think, well, they've just left the city, they've just been expelled from the city, they've just been defeated. Would they go back then to try and defend the city, which is now being ruled by the Fatimids, just as the Crusaders arrived? And so it seems likely, but at the end of the day, we don't know the full story. But that's what happened. And so the wazir, the governor, is a man called Iftikhar ad-Dawla, the Fatimid wazir, and he's the one in Jerusalem when the Crusaders arrived. And when they arrived, they had this really big task of how to get through and break the walls of Jerusalem and then enter the city. So you had three or four main crusade leaders. You had Bohemond of Taranto, you had Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Flanders, Robert of Normandy. These are the major crusade leaders. And so what they did initially was that they began to catapult the walls of the city. In catapulting walls of the city, it worked for a while, but there was a major problem. And this is something the Crusaders realized on their way from the port of Jaffa all the way down to Jerusalem, passing Ramla. They're passing through Ramla, and they get into Jerusalem, and they realize there's a major problem, because what Iftikhar ad-Dawla did is he did two or three things. One was that he poisoned the wells around the city of Jerusalem. Okay, so on the route that the Crusaders are taking, from the west, from the port coming eastwards down into Jerusalem, the wells are poisoned, so it's restricting access for Crusaders to have water. Second thing is he's removing all livestock, so all the livestock he's removing, so they won't have access to meat and to food. And that's a major problem for the Crusaders, because when the Crusaders are launching the attack on the walls of Jerusalem, it's really hot. That's another thing. It's so hot. It's coming to the summer months, and they're really struggling in the heat, struggling with lack of food, and struggling with lack of water because the wells are poisoned. And so what do they do then? They decide to make a direct assault. This is June 1099, because it was December 1098 when they made their launch, their march towards Jerusalem, and then they get there by June of the next year, 1099. And in the beginning of that month, the 2nd or the 3rd of June, they make a direct assault onto the walls of Jerusalem. They positioned themselves. One of the leaders was in the northern wall, another was northeastern wall. I think the other one was south wall. And they begin their assault. But it couldn't last very long, because not only are they impeded because of their own sense of fatigue, and that's frustrating, but also because of lack of resources. Right, so even though Iftikhar ad-Dawla within the city of Jerusalem, he has a band of strong men. He has Arab and Sudanese soldiers, army, which is quite strong within the walls of Jerusalem. It was not enough to man every wall within the city of Jerusalem. It wasn't enough to do that. So although they were skilled fighters, it was not enough to do that. Within the city, however, they were at the Tower of David, the quadrangular tower, two very big towers within the city of Jerusalem that provided a lot of aid and assistance. And so when the Crusaders were unable, therefore, to to catapult the city repeatedly, and therefore hope for some kind of a breakthrough, they all of a sudden something happened which was to great advantage for the Crusaders, and that is that these reinforcements arrived from Genoese ships and ships from England at the port of Jaffa. Jaffa is the closest port to Jerusalem, and so they arrived with food, they arrived with weapons, they arrived with timber, wood, rope, right, with so many things, and it arrived just at the right time when the Crusaders people were deserting, they were losing hope, they were there, they were in Jerusalem, and this for them was like being, in heaven. It's like the main place for them to be at that time. And so when the reinforcements came from Jaffa of wood, I mean, they needed all the things they needed to make the catapults, to make the siege towers, to make the battering rams, right? All of these things were made from the new supplies from the Genoese and the English ships coming into the port of Jaffa. And with that timber, they built 2 very large siege towers, okay? And so when they built the siege towers, they could now station them. They could now wheel them, to the right locations in the northeast, in the north. One on the wall of Mount Zion. They put them in the right positions, and then they began the bombardment, of the walls of Jerusalem. And this was happening. It was going on. The Muslims, there was news of a reinforcements coming from Egypt, from the Fatimid Empire of Egypt, to bring aid and assistance into Jerusalem. There was also, that we discussed last time, the shipment of the naval force of Yusuf ibn Tashufin, that great ruler of the Maghrib, of the Marabitun, who lent aid and assistance to the Muslims of Al-Andalus. We spoke a lot about Al-Andalus in the first episode. He was the one that they kept calling because the Christian states of Leon and Navarre and Castile and Aragon are becoming so strong. Above them are, of course, the mountains of Asturias and Galicia. Above all of that is the state of Normandy, France, and so therefore they're getting so much help and assistance, and they're coming downwards, and they're pitting these Muluk al-Tawa'if, these small party kingdoms, one against the other, of Asija and of Seville and other places. And so that same Yusuf ibn Tashufin sent a naval force to come to the rescue of the Muslims of Jerusalem, but it was too late. It was too late for them. By that time, Al-Quds, Jerusalem, was already captured by the Crusaders. And so, therefore, in these cases, what they did is that they began the bombardment. They made these siege towers. Something happened. So I think it was about a few days before the siege was successful. There was one of the Crusader rulers. He has, I think it was I can't remember his name, but he had a dream that the Christians have to show a better penance and have to purify themselves and everything. And so what the Crusaders they did is that they did a kind of a walking march around the walls of Jerusalem. Imagine the spectacle, imagine the display, of that sense of devotion. They're making this march around the walls of Jerusalem barefoot, right? So you imagine these soldiers have come, to fight, and they've got their swords and all of that. But in this one instance, they're making this barefoot march around Jerusalem, okay? And they're holding relics, Christian relics, and they're singing and they're reciting prayers. And that was all to reflect this act of penance. Remember, of course, the big motivation for many Crusaders, not all, because some, of course, were motivated by secular reasons, for money and for wealth and for settlement in the kingdom of Jerusalem, but for many others, it would have been religious devotion. The people who heard the speeches of Urban, not only in Clermont, where we discussed, but what about all the other places, even in Al-Andalus, because Urban went on a mission himself to go and speak to different crowds, particularly on the festivals of the feasts, on the festival of the saint feast, on the saints feast days. He went to the Santiago, if I remember. He went to Tours, I think, Aquitaine, these major places, where people had gathered, and so a lot of that, of course, was really about Christian devotion. Of course, they're using it in this sense for war against Muslims based on lies and othering and false accounts and misinformation, but they're still going with that sense of religious duty and hoping for forgiveness of sins. And so that act of marching around the towers of Jerusalem barefoot, holding the artifacts and making the prayers, is really, I think, a culmination of that, what they originally set out for. And that's really what they were told, therefore, by the Crusade leaders, was that remember your intention in the first place. They were told to make peace because there were Crusade leaders who were feuding with one another, and they used the occasion to make peace between themselves. So they could, of course, and that, of course, created more of a resilience, unity. The morale was very strong in the Crusader camp. And then what they did is that in the night, where they had the siege tower in one place, which was bombarding the tower, they decided to dismantle the tower and then to move it to another location, which they thought would be better because there was some kind of a breach in the wall of that tower, or it was a kind of a weaker position, and they moved the siege tower to the location, and that's where they had their success. And so it was Godfrey of Bouillon, and he was the leader, in fact, of that, who scaled the tower, and then others scaled the tower after him, and they were the first ones who managed to get through from the part where they caught the Muslims off guard and surprised, because they dismantled the tower, then made it again in a new location, and that's where they focused their efforts. Godfrey of Bouillon was, by the way, he was appointed the first, the king of Jerusalem, because of he was heroized. He was a hero, heroized in that occasion of the siege and assault into Jerusalem. And so when they get through into Jerusalem, it's going to be this chaos. It's just going to be chaos, because the Muslim inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem, men, women, children, elderly. The other thing, by the way, that Iftikhar ad-Dawla, the Fatimid Wazir in Jerusalem, did, is that he expelled all the Christians. Now he did that probably because he was scared that they would turn on the Muslims if the Crusaders entered Jerusalem. So perhaps his motivation was, I got to make sure that any people who would turn against us are out of here. And so he expelled them all. I think there was a problem in that, because it's likely that the Crusaders who have just been kicked out of the city, once they see Crusaders arriving, are going to be the first ones going to join the Crusaders against the Fatimids in Jerusalem. And so I think that perhaps was a mistake, perhaps maybe not on his part, but in any case it is as it is, and it happened. And so when Godfrey of Bouillon and his the scalers, those who are scaling the ladders, enter into Jerusalem, there is, of course, intense fighting, intense killing. The Crusaders are just killing everybody. They killed all the Jews, they killed all the Muslims, of that city. The Muslims are fleeing to the Dome of the Rock and into the Al-Aqsa mosques, hoping for sanctuary there, and to make some kind of terms and make some peace, with the Crusaders. In some instances, the Crusade leaders, Godfrey of Bouillon in this case and others, are promising the Muslims peace if they surrendered, and when they do, then they massacre them and then they kill them. So that was happening, I mean, to women and children and men, and some of the Crusader accounts are very horrific about, what they did to the Muslims. They describe things like the smell of blood and flesh was so much. In a very famous account of the Gesta Francorum that says that the horses were up to their hooves, I think, or their knees in blood. Of course, it's not an accurate description. It's hyperbolic, but it was supposed to reflect a kind of a biblical vengeance, and that was the reason why this language was quoted in such a vernacular, such a language and such imagery, because it was supposed to reflect the way that God's punishment against the Maccabees and Moabites in the Old Testament is now being enacted out against the Muslims of Jerusalem, so that when the Christians in Europe read these accounts, they can say, well, that's what happened. God's punishment befell the Muslims, and in the same way that it befell those who were punished in the Old Testament. In other cases, Albert of Aachen's account, a German chronicler, who says that they would smash the heads of the babies against the walls. These things happened. I mean, gruesome things. Just an all-out killing. I remember we spoke last time, I think, in the Inquisition about the Dios la Quer. The Dios la Quer, which was in fact later than this, because that was now the days of the Spanish Inquisition, where you had people like Thomas de Torquemada, Nicholas Emerick authored his Directorum Inquisitorium. The first Grand Inquisitor was Thomas Torquemada, but he became famous because of his words Dios la Quer, which means God wills it. He took that in fact from the Crusaders in the First Crusade, because what they're saying in Latin is Deus vult. Deus vult means God wills it. And so if God wills it, whatever injustice we're perpetrating against these people, whatever ruthless, barbaric slaughter of these people, Deus vult, God wills it. In the Spanish Inquisition, when they're doing such horrific things to Muslims, but also Jews, because they're deemed to be heretics because of their anti-Trinitarianism, the words are Dios la Quer, God wills it, God wills it. In any case, they're saying that, they're doing it, they're saying it, they're killing, and all of it is Deus vult, God wills it to happen. And even the Crusaders was saying things like eyewitnesses who said that we couldn't believe the amount of flesh, the amount of blood, the amount of bodies in Jerusalem, because they're killing everybody. The numbers, of course, of how many were killed are going to vary depending on the source. So the Gesta Francorum has the numbers killed in Jerusalem at around 60,000. Matthew of Edessa's account is about 10,000. Now Ibn al-Athir's account, which is, we'll read it together now, it's on the screen as you can see, has the numbers as at 75,000. We do of course have to be honest and say, well, his account is a much later account. Ibn Athir was in the late 1200s, late 1100s, my mistake, and so and he was a great champion, supporter of the Zengid family of Nuruddin Zengi, Imaduddin Zengi. The main thing, of course, that's been emphasized is the fact that the killing was a lot. It was a slaughter of the people, and so whether we take the account of the Gesta Francorum or Matthew Edessa's account or Ibn Athir's account, they're all emphasizing one thing, which is the fact there was a slaughter of the people. The exact numbers of how many were killed is going to differ, of course, because we're dealing with different sources, and some of them were not there, but they had it from other sources, and therefore that's just how history is. And so but what we can say that it was just a slaughter of the people, men, women and children included. The only ones they mainly spared were in fact the farmers, because they needed to learn how to cultivate the fields and to grow the crops, and they needed to know about irrigation and these things. This is why they kept the farmers alive, for these things. But on the whole, everybody else was slaughtered. What they would do is that they would, when the bodies of the Muslims and even the Jews had heaped up, they would set them on fire. They would command the surviving Muslims to set the bodies of the deceased the killed Muslims on fire, and once they'd done that, then they would kill the ones who did that. So that's how they would do it. They would set them on fire, and then they would kill the people who did that. So it was just an all-out slaughter, of the Muslims of that city. Now, if we look together at the account here. This is from a book called Arab Historians of the Crusades by Francesco Gabrielli. The trouble with this source, although it's good because it has these excerpts of Muslim sources translated, it's originally written in Italian and then into English and then into Arabic, or maybe Italian, Arabic, English, something like this. But there's going to be some difficulties in the translation, but we'll have a look at it anyway. And so here we are. Let's have a look. 1 second. Browser. All right. Okay. Here we are. So this is Franks Conquer Jerusalem. Ibn Athir. Chapter 10, page 193 to 195, begins by saying that Taj ad-Dawla Tutush was the lord of Jerusalem, but had given it as a fief to the emir Suqman ibn Artuk, the Turkoman. When the Franks defeated the Turks at Antioch, the massacre demoralized them, and the Egyptians, who saw that the Turkish armies were being weakened by desertion, besieged Jerusalem under the command of Al-Afdal Ibn Badr al-Jamali. Okay, so Badr al-Jamali, of course, had just died, isn't it? He died. When did he die? 1092. This is Al-Afdal Ibn Badr al-Jamali. Therefore, as I mentioned before, the idea was that Antioch had just been taken, and then that's 1098, and so is that 1098? Yeah, and that was a time where the Fatimids took power from the Seljuks of Jerusalem. Inside the city were Artuk's sons Suqman and Al-Ghazi, their cousin Sunij, and their nephew Yaquti. The Egyptians brought more than 40 siege engines to attack Jerusalem and broke down the walls at several points. The inhabitants put up a defense, and the siege and fighting went on for more than 6 weeks. In the end, the Egyptians forced the city to capitulate in Sha'ban 489, August 1096. Suqman, Al-Ghazi, and their friends were well treated by Al-Afdal. By the way, when the Crusaders came into Jerusalem, it was Ramadan. So it was Ramadan of that year, and Muslims who were the defenders of the city were in fact fasting. They were in fact fasting. Who gave them large gifts of money and let them go free. They made for Damascus and then crossed the Euphrates. Suqman settled in Edessa, and Al-Ghazi went on to Iraq. The Egyptian governor of Jerusalem was a certain Iftikhar ad-Dawla, we've discussed right now today, who was still there at the time of which we are speaking. He says, after their vain attempts to take Acre by siege, the siege of Acre would happen a long time after this, but this is the first attempt to take Acre by siege. The Franks moved on to Jerusalem and besieged it for more than 6 weeks. They built 2 towers, one of which near Sion. Sion is Mount Zion. Mount Zion is very important, as a site for Jews, Christians, and also Muslims, because Mount Zion is where Christians believe the final supper from the New Testament, description of Jesus' final supper with his disciples happens at Mount Zion. There is a church built there now, and it has an inner room, and that's where they believe Jesus had his last supper with his disciples. They also believe that the site contains the site where the Prophet Dawood alayhi salam, David, is buried. That the site itself, in fact, is contested because we know that because even though now people, they go there and they think it's the place where the Prophet Dawood alayhi salam is buried, the building in fact was a Crusader building. The Crusades in fact made that building over a tomb. The tomb in fact is an empty tomb, but they believed it to be the site where Dawood alayhi salam was buried, and since that time it's been a place of veneration by people who go there to see that. But it can't be true, because that's what the Crusaders built during their time in the city of Jerusalem. But that's Mount Zion. Mount Zion in fact is the highest point within that part of Jerusalem. It's the highest point, and it has these therefore significance. So what he did is, therefore, he built his siege tower on near Zion. The Muslims burnt down, killing everyone inside it. It had scarcely ceased to burn before a messenger arrived to ask for help and to bring the news that the other side of the city had fallen. In fact, Jerusalem was taken from the north on the morning of Friday, 22nd Sha'ban. Where are we? Yeah, 15th July, 1099. Alright, so the population was put to the sword by the Franks, so therefore it wasn't, exactly Ramadan, but close to Ramadan. But some people were fasting because of Sha'ban fasting anyway. Population was put to the sword by the Franks, who pillaged this area for a week. A band of Muslims barricaded themselves into the oratory of David and fought on for several days. They were granted their lives in return for surrendering. The Franks honored their word, and the group left by night for Ascalon. In the Masjid al-Aqsa, the Franks slaughtered more than 70. This is the account then, that they slaughtered more than 70,000 people, among them a large number of imams and Muslim scholars, devout and ascetic men who had left their homelands to live lives of pious seclusion in the holy place. This is something that comes across a lot in the Muslim poetry. My book and my research was about Muslim poetry during this time. And so the biggest mentions really of Al-Aqsa are to do with Al-Aqsa as a place of seclusion, as a place of prayer, as a place of remembrance of Allah. It says the Franks stripped the dome of the rock of more than 40 silver candelabra, each of them weighing 3,600 drams, and a great silver lamp weighing 44 Syrian pounds, as well as 150 smaller silver candelabra, and more than 20 gold ones, and a great deal more booty. Refugees from Syria reached Baghdad in Ramadan, among them the Qadi Abu Said al-Harawi. So in my book I have a very lengthy section on this poem that's going to be recounted in this part of Gabrielli's book. My opening section after introduction, in fact, is the first response, to the Crusader capture of Jerusalem, the first most poetic responses. And so I discuss 3 poems that are historically recorded. One is a poem by Abu Muzaffar al-Abi Wardi, which is the one that Abu Sa'id al-Harawi recounts and relays in the court of Baghdad, because he goes to seek help from the Sunni Khalif. And the other one is a poem by a man called Ibn al-Khayyat in his Diwan Ibn al-Khayyat. He authors a very lengthy poem about the situation of the Muslims of Jerusalem. He says in his poem, أحل الكفر بالإسلام ضيما يطول عليه دين النجيب فحق ضائع وحما مباح وسيف قاطئ ودم سبيب. He says أحل الكفر بالإسلام ضيما. He says that the disbelief has made licit everything that was illicit. All the things that were forbidden are now become allowed. And our women who were inviolable have now become like spoils of war. And he says that so he's therefore venting the sense of outrage at the way that everything has become tumultuous. Al-Abi Wardi's poem, he begins by saying it, كيف تنام العين ملء جفونها الحفوات أيقظت كل نائم وإخوانكم بالشام يضحي مقيلهم ظهور المذاكئ وبطون القشائم. He says that أهل الكفر, that disbelief has made licit again. وكيف تنام العين, how will the eyes sleep between the lids at a time like this that would awaken any sleeper, when your brothers in Sham, in Syria, are sleeping on the belly, in the bellies of vultures, right? Then he says, وَيُنَادِي, that's like the Prophet is calling, from Tayba, which is Medina, you wake up, O sons of Hashim. And it's really an appeal to the religious authorities, to the political authorities, to come to aid and assistance. So we have these three. We have another one from an anonymous poet, recorded in the text by Ibn Taghribirdi, which is a history of Egypt, called Nujum al-Zahira. And so these were the first initial responses to the capture of Jerusalem. But there was also another one, I think we discussed it last time, maybe not, and that was the text written by Ali ibn Tahir as-Sulami, which is called Kitab al-Jihad, and this was the first religious scholarly response to the occupation of Jerusalem, written in 1105. He died 1106, and he began to have these readings in around Syria. In fact, in a masjid called Masjid, what is it called? Beit Lahiyya. The Masjid of Beit Lahiyya is a suburb of Damascus, and although he was Shafi'i faqih, in the Umayyad mosque, the readings were held in the Masjid of Beit Lahiyya, in suburb of Damascus, and probably in many different parts, because it's quite a long book. In my book, I translated all of the major poems found in his book, about the situation, and so it's quite an interesting thing if you ever get a chance to read my book called The Cutting Edge of the Poet's Sword: Muslim Poetic Responses to the Crusades. It's available on Amazon, but I suggest you should, if you're going to buy it, buy it from the publisher Brill, because it's widely available there, and I think it's maybe a bit cheaper also. And so he says, here we are, where are we? Now they told the, sorry, I'm going to find this quickly. Here we are. It says that and so refugees from Syria reached Baghdad in Ramadan, among them the Qadi Abu Sa'id al-Harawi. They told the Caliph's ministers a story that wrung their hearts and brought tears to their eyes. On Friday, they went to the cathedral mosque, meaning the Jami'ah mosque, the main central mosque, and begged for help, weeping so that their hearts wept with them as they described the suffering of the Muslims in that holy city. The men killed, the women and children taken prisoner, the homes pillaged. Because of the terrible hardships that they had suffered, they were allowed to break the fast. So therefore, that would have been in Ramadan. Okay. And then here we are. This is the poem. Okay, which we can see. It was a discord between the Muslim princes, as well as we shall describe, that enabled the Franks to overrun the country. So this is, of course, harkening back to the idea that the division, the disunity, was a major factor. Not only the Sunni and Shia divide, because right before they came, one is taking power from the other ones, but also within the Sunni camp, between the sons of Malik Shah, Muhammad Barak Yaruk, and other things as well. The Seljuks amongst themselves were also infighting. And this was all division, and this is all weakness. And so Abu Muzaffar al-Bawardi composed several poems on the subject, in one of which he says, we have mingled blood with flowing tears, and there is no room left in us for pity. To shed tears is a man's worst weapon when the swords stir up the embers of war. Sons of Islam, behind you are battles in which heads rolled at your feet. He's speaking kind of in the context of the Battle of Manzika, Alp Arsalan, great warriors who came just before. There you slumber in the blessed shade of safety, where life is as soft as an orchard flower, appealing like to the trappings of the dunya. And these things, how can the eye sleep between the lids at a time of disasters that would awaken in the sleeper, while your Syrian brothers can only sleep on the backs of their chargers or in vultures' bellies? Must the foreigners feed on our ignominy, while you trail behind you the train of a pleasant life? like men whose world is at peace, meaning saying, why are you so encapsulated with the world and the dunya when your brothers are suffering in Syria? When blood has been spilt, when sweet girls must for shame hide their lovely faces in their hands, when the white sword points are red with blood, and the iron of the brown lances is stained with gore. At the sound of sword hammering on lance, young children's hair turns white. This is war, and the man who shuns the whirlpool to save his life shall grind his teeth in penitence. This is war, and the infidel's sword is naked in his hand, ready to be sheathed again in men's necks and skulls. This is war, and he who lies in the tomb of Medina seems to raise his voice and cry, O son of Hashem. So very, very, very evocative words, very evocative words. And so these were the first initial responses to the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. The Crusaders, of course, would proceed to capture other territory, Dorylaeum and Antioch as well, and these things happened just a year, I think 1 or 2 years after 1101, after taking of Jerusalem. And then, of course, much more is going to happen, which we will inshallah cover inshallah the week next week. In fact, I'm in Jerusalem, inshallah, Al-Aqsa, Al-Quds Sharif myself, so I will not probably be able to do this unless, of course, I could do it there. Maybe if we find an opportunity to do that, I could attempt it there. But if not, then the week after, and I will make a notice on my Facebook page to make an announcement, to inform everyone. I'm going to inshallah end it here. Inshallah, may Allah bless you again, for your attendance. Jazakallah khairan. And I hope inshallah we took something of some benefit today. May Allah bless all of you. Jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.